Good morning. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with my colleague Elsie today. I'm a layperson. Elsie is a midwife, so I think this presentation, right from its off, was designed as midwives and mothers working in collaboration, and I hope that comes through from our presentation. Do you want to say any words of introduction, Elsie, or should I just get going?
No, just get going.
So I'm going to give you a bit of the background to the Halcyon and its closure, and then Elsie's going to talk to us about what's happening now. So back in February, I was watching the wonderful London presentations from the Maternity and Midwifery Festival. And just a few days later, I was privileged to be invited as a representative from AIMS to a very important meeting about the closure of the Halcyon and what was going to happen next for that local community. And it just seemed to me that this was an issue that would be good to bring to this regional conference. So I want to just say something about who's not here on the stage with us today. So Elsie and I are here, but we also represent the Women's Health and Maternity Network in the local area where the Halcyon is located. And they can't be with us today, but they're here in spirit. Could I just ask too, before we get started, has anyone come across from Birmingham or the Black Country today to be here? Great, thank you. Okay. So what I want to do first is locate the Halcyon Birth Centre. So the Halcyon Birth Centre was just located to the west of Birmingham in an area called Sandwell, and more specifically in a town called Smethwick. Just a little bit about Sandwell. Sandwell is ranked as the 13th most deprived local authority out of the 326 in England. So it's quite a deprived neighbourhood, and it's also an extremely ethnically diverse borough. And the reason I'm presenting those statistics is I'm sure you'll all be aware in the recent long-term plan of the NHS, the long-term plan asks us to pay particular attention to services for women in such communities. The Halcyon Birth Centre is one of the new wave of birth centres. It was established as part of a local reconfiguration of services, which saw the closure of an obstetric unit and the moving out of the community of obstetric services. And the Smethwick-based birth centre became a key element following consultation of that new configuration. It was an element in the new configuration that came firmly out of a strong process of public consultation and then was taken up by the local trust, who proudly announced its existence in their quality accounts the following year. So, the building of the Halcyon was much awaited in the local community. It was actually delayed in its inauguration, but eventually it was built and opened in November 2011. And that was quite an interesting time for a new freestanding birth centre to be developed, because it was just afterwards that we had, or in fact the month before, that we had the Birthplace Research that I'm sure all of you will be familiar with, that really started to turn the tide of public opinion about out-of-hospital birth. So from the 1970s, as you'll all know, we've sort of been fed this notion that the only place to give birth safely is in the hospital. And a really important program of research has been taking place since then to try and overturn that. The Birthplace Research, which supported birth out of the hospital environment, was fairly swiftly, in NICE terms, followed up by new NICE recommendations, which ensures that all midwives are able to have reference to an evidence base to support women's choice in place of birth. And the third element of context I'd like to draw attention to is the National Health Service England's policy of encouraging a broader diversity in birthplace settings. So I don't know If any of you have watched this video, this was Claire Matthews at one of these festivals just last year. I think this is from the London festival last year, 2018, where Claire talked about the 4-4-20 ambition by 2020. Has anyone heard of that, remember that? So that was basically the NHS England saying that by 2020, just next year, they would like to see 20% of births taking place in alongside midwifery units, 4% of all births taking place in freestanding midwifery units, and 4% of births taking place at home. So these were quite challenging ambitions that the NHS England was setting out. I mention that because everything seemed to be coming together from the Halcyon. Indeed, this time last year, there were a number of birth centres celebrated as being beacons of midwifery excellence, and the Halcyon and its sister unit, the Serenity, was chosen to be one of these beacon sites. So everything was going well. Here's a picture of the Halcyon bespoke new build birth centre. We had the high quality research evidence, we had the NICE clinical guidelines, we had the national policy direction coming out of Better Births, which was very much supportive of choice in place of birth. And we had this beacon status awarded. And then the local population woke up to this. This was really quite a shock for the local population. Elsie and I were recently at a meeting with the chair of the CCG, and I think we shared the view there that this had been quite a shock, and shocks weren't in anybody's interest. So a group of us have been engaged in a process of asking, as Helen encouraged us to do earlier this morning, of asking the question why, of really trying to dig deep, because it's all very well as birth activists for our first reaction to be, this shouldn't close, this shouldn't happen. But we've decided to take an approach where we're really trying to look at the local circumstances and think about what exactly happened in this case. We've got an apparent mismatch here, haven't we, between the national policy context and the local context. But this isn't just an issue that's relevant to the Halcyon birth closure. Again, as Helen mentioned earlier, we're having these centres closed down. Helen said nearly one every week. I think she's talking about temporary closures as well. But certainly, we have a constant stream of birth centres closing. And the question is why, then what we do about it. How I'd like to position my involvement in this story is this, however. As I say, it's often very easy as activists, and certainly AIMS has done this very well in the past, when something closes down, a service changes, to stand up and complain and simply seek to get that service reinstated. But a more collaborative approach in this case, I think, around asking the questions of why, could lead to good outcomes for the local community in that area, and that's what we're trying to explore.
Thank you. So, as Joe mentioned, I'm Elsie Gayle. I am a midwife, still in practice. And I was really fortunate to have been a part of this whole journey to setting up the Halcyon, or certainly around the consultation to set up the Halcyon. It happened as a result of a merger between two main trusts, and then the need to reconfigure the service because of particular issues that were ongoing there. So I was leading the Birmingham Link Women's Health and Maternity Group as a volunteer at the time of the consultation. So I took part in the consultation, as well as observing the whole of the consultation. And it was one of the best consultations I can tell you ever. It was deep, it was far, it was wide. It actually touched on all aspects that a consultation should. At the time, I do know that issues had been raised with the PCT as it was then, looking at, so the issues that were raised were the need for the governance around standalone birth centres. How How are they sustained? How will they continue to operate in the climate that existed in maternity services? So looking at things like autonomous midwives, safe culture and climate of the working environment, and we heard earlier about bullying in the workplace, and then the trust supporting the staff to be accountable practitioners, and that's all staff. Looking at continuing to maintain experienced and well-managed midwives and support staff. And certainly for me, the issues around culturally safe, woman-centered care in this ethnically rich area. So these things were actually raised with the PCT at the time. So moving on then, it was a bit of a shock, as Joe said, for the community to hear that this wonderful birth center, the Halcyon, was actually going to close. The challenge that happened, there was a discussion between the CCG with Health Watch and the Health Overview and Scrutiny Committee. There was very little, what I would say, robust challenge. It was accepted that there were issues with the Halcyon, the standalone birth center, and it was no longer viable. So these two bodies, both Health Watch and the Overview and Scrutiny Committee of the local authority, accepted that what the Trust and the CCG were proposing needed to happen. The Halcyon had to close. The main challenge, though, came from HAPIA, a national body, Health Watch and Public Involvement Association, and then the Friends of the Halcyon campaigning group came out of the local concerns about losing such a bespoke unit. And out of that, the Women's Health and Maternity Network, which I'll talk a little bit about later as we go. What the Trust did do was they didn't consult. What they did do was to have a communication strategy. So they had open meetings with their staff where they just informed them that the unit was going to close. They spoke to neighboring trusts to let them know as well, because in the locality, women were choosing to have perhaps antenatal care in one area, they would birth somewhere else. So neighboring trusts who were affected needed to know. The local press, so it was on the television, it was also on the radio that the Halcyon was closing. And the main issue was that the births had diminished. There were only 17 births in the last year prior to the closure. Trust board meetings also mentioned it, and then the individual conversations were had with the midwives who were looking after women in the locality to say the Halcyon was closing and they were having, they could either have a home birth or come into the Serenity unit or the main labour ward. Community discussions then took place, and a group of women came together, decided to use the democratic processes, the service user voice, engaging other people in the local communities, including the local councillors, the CCG, and the local community organizations. So we decided to have a meeting on the 3rd of December. People were contacted through Facebook groups, WhatsApp, community meetings. The councillors were contacted by email. The CCG was actually invited to attend. And we had over 40 people come to the meeting. So we had local moms, birth workers, councillors. The CCG representative was one of the commissioners, and we had 3 guest speakers. I actually am a parliamentary outreach trainer So what we did was move the annual parliamentary week to engage the democratic process of helping people to understand how it is that we raise a voice using the democratic processes of Parliament. I looked at the local statistics around the birthing outcomes in the Black country and used that in relation to the latest Embrace report, which described the rise in mortality for some of the most disadvantaged women in the area. We also considered the continuity of care model, which was suitable for local improvement, and how this would help to be achieved through using the Halcyon birthing unit, should it be reopened. We had Beverly Lawrence Beach, latterly of Ames. She continues to be an activist in terms of freestanding midwifery-led units and the adverse effects on healthy mothers and babies. She talked about the dangers of centralizing maternity care into obstetric units, and she argued for the case of the Halcyon to be reopened to counteract the risk of unnecessary birth interventions. Then we had Malcolm Alexander, who is the chair of HAPIA. He talked about the process of consultation and the duty of CCGs to consult when there is a change in service. He outlined the importance of the consultation, talked to the CCGs about the duty to consult and the use of the overview and scrutiny. He also mentioned the local councillors and the MPs' involvement in the decision. And finally, we agreed, as a result of that meeting, that we would demonstrate our disappointment about the closure and the non-involvement of consultation. The roundtable discussions that we had, the women were saying things like, we had 7 tables. Women were saying that they needed to use the local media to raise their awareness. They needed to ask questions, not just accepting what they were told. They needed to ask questions and seeking information so that they could make informed decisions about their birthing choices. Women were saying that they were not listened to, and that they wanted their voices to be heard. As a result of the meeting then, the Friends of the Halcyon did a survey of the local community. Most of the women who responded had never heard of the Halcyon, and they were offered one of the least choices that were given when they were having their birth discussion was the Halcyon, and that was totally not agreed in terms of the discussion that was held at the Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting. So, Friends of the Halcyon then undertook to survey 10 midwives who were working in the locality. Most of them could not actually come forward to speak openly because of the fear of retribution. But they were speaking in terms of not being able to manage their workload because of shortages and the excessive workloads that they were expected to do. So for example, one midwife said she was expected to work on the community, be on call in the evening, perhaps go out to a birth in the night, or indeed be called into the main unit or to the alongside unit to work, and then the next day having to either take annual leave or indeed to step away in terms of doing 3 hours on and then having time off to sleep, which she didn't think was a way for her to work in terms of her work-life balance. Midwives, some of whom had left, were saying that they were not consulted. They were just told that the unit was going to close. And some of them were very disappointed because they had thought they were being able to work in such a unit in a way that was pleasing for them, and they would be able to manage their own work-life balance. So they had a problem in terms of shortage of staff and the workload. And that was the main complaint of the midwives when we surveyed them. This actually was reflected in the recent letter where the 16 experts of midwifery wrote to The Guardian on the 14th of February this year. And one of the things that was really, really striking was the fact that the trust was putting forward that the women did not choose. They voted with their feet, when actually they didn't know that the Halcyon existed. And what was highlighted in the letter is that women's choice is not the primary factor in the declining numbers. So there is, some investigation to do there. They also found, or they also said, that motivated midwives can provide holistic, community-based, safe care, protective of women's health, and it is cost-effective. That kind of coincided with some of the things that the midwives were saying. So far then, what we have are two groups who are working. One, the Friends of the Halcyon, which is a campaigning group, and that's working more widely in terms of an activist group, campaigning, trying to find solutions, working right across the field to engage and try to see how it is that we can actually get some sort of continuity of care from a community-based place. The Women's Health and Maternity Network is based in the community, and that is a group of women who've had babies, their families, some fathers, and midwives who are working towards engaging the women. There seems to be quite a large amount of information gap. So it's really about helping the women to understand the processes, learning about what choices there are, how to make those choices, how to be effective in achieving the sort of birth that they would like to have. There's a national campaigning bodies that both groups are linked to, so that includes AIMS. And there are international birth organizations in North America and the Caribbean that are working alongside us. People who have been successful in actually maintaining birth centers where women can get woman-centered care. We do know that there have been 2 proposals put forward to reopen the Halcyon and utilize it effectively and sustainably. And then we've had several meetings with the CCG. So the first meeting with the CCG was when the women decided on the 5th of December that they would attend one of the CCG board meetings. And some of the things they addressed the chair. They said that they were not consulted, the women who wanted to use the Halcyon. They referred the closure to the HOSC, but they didn't give them time to talk to the councillors or the MP. They mentioned that the CCG had a duty in law to consult and engage. They also had a duty to involve the community in the changes. And in determining the local needs, they wanted to be listened to as service users to act so that their needs would be met. They were very concerned that the Halcyon was closed without their consultation or indeed any agreement at all about how the services would run. What has happened is that since the meeting, the local Maternity Voices Partnership has been set up, and meetings are taking place with the CCG as well as with the MVP. And we're looking towards reopening the debate with the local maternity services about reconfiguration of the services. The last meeting we had with the CCG, it was attended by members of the 2 groups, service users, midwives, and the lead for Happier. It was agreed that if it was that we could find a way forward in terms of sustaining the Halcyon, then they would consider reopening it. In the meantime, women are actually working towards learning, getting their voices heard, seeing how it is that they can actually have services that are safe for them to use, and to improve the figures in such a diverse area where, in fact, the figures are not as good as other areas. And this is just a picture of the women who presented the letter at the CCG board meeting, because they really do not want to be left behind. So thanks very much. Do you want water?
We have about a minute for a question, if anyone's got a question. And we have a roving mic here, because I know there was a lot to get through in the session. One question, fabulous. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Vanessa Hallam, Derby midwife. Can you just explain, I was a little bit unclear, how your staffing worked? Were you community midwives on call, and then if a labourer came in, they went into the Halcyon and delivered them there, or was there a permanent staff at the Halcyon?
Right, so I didn't work there. I'm just, I'm just an activist in terms of getting woman-centered care. What the midwives said, and in fact, one midwife actually attended the CCG meeting. What she said was, it was staffed when women went into labour. So the women would then phone the main unit and say, I am booked for the Halcyon. And if there was a midwife available, then she would go over, open up the unit, and then the woman would come in. The woman who attended the last CCG meeting, when she rang up, she was told she had to come in because there was no midwife. And that was happening quite a lot. Yeah, so it was only staffed when the women who were booked there, who knew about it and were booked, went into labour if there was a midwife available.
That's great. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. And I'm sure Elsie and Joe will be around so you can actually address personal, well, not personal questions, but questions to them, because you're around for lunchtime. Yeah?
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much.